Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I'll jump right into it. I'm going to talk a bit about how to understand concept and spatial representation in models and brains through task theory-based analysis and interventions. So, just very briefly, as Nicole said, I joined uh, CNET, Center for Center for Information and Neural Networks, very recently in May, and this is our building here. It also is affiliated with the University of Osaka. So what the lab is focused on is how we learn and represent concepts. We also care a lot about the brain, but also using models. And so different projects include like how we learn categories from early on to forming consolidated semantic concepts. These various techniques like modeling for IMEG, the stimulation techniques as well. On the other side, we also have projects working on how to make deep neural networks as a better model of brain, making more human-inspired models, and also projects on healthy aging. So this is the kind of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. I first sorry, what do you call it? Disclaimer. I kind of rewrote this my standard talk a bit today. Um, and it's the first time I'm giving it in this way, so hopefully it'll be not too bad and smooth. But basically, I reframed it in a way to talk about some things I've been thinking about, like how to approach our research question, but also because I wanted to talk about a few different topics that might not be entirely related to each other. And I might have made it too much, so I might need to skip some things. So sorry in advance. But I'll be talking about concept learning and representation. We're going to talk about it's got a little bit vision focus, but the interest is really in general a modal semantic concepts. I'm going to talk a bit about spatial brain representations, and if there's time, I will talk about aging as well. So yeah, the idea is how can we understand how these things work in brains and models through task analysis and interventions. Here's a talk overview. First have kind of like build my argument on how we should build explanations. Then there's three projects, if I can get through them. The first one is general learning mechanism with hippocampal formation. The second one will be looking at spatial representation using a deep neural network approach. And finally, time we'll talk a bit about how we've been trying to model brain aging, specifically category representations in the aging brain. So how do we kind of understand the brain? Or rather explain, because understanding is kind of a vague term. Explanation may still be a bit relative, but then at least it's a bit more concrete, right? So in the philosophy of science, philosophy of neuroscience and mechanistic explanation is relatively clear. So like, for example, how things work together, like in our case, it's like neurons or sort of units work together to represent or compute something like value or how they work together to implement an action. So what are we trying to explain? Various things exist in our field. Like there's human behaviors or model behaviors, and we're trying to potentially explain how we are able to do those like interesting behaviors. Like what's the maybe some cognitive capacity allows us to do that. We also have different brain representations. So large scale brain networks, um, high dimensional multivariate patterns, down to single cell recording, right? So these are interesting things, and the common thing to do is like to analyze these things, maybe link behavior and brain. Quite commonly, we also have models. So the models might capture some behavior, might capture some brain activity. Sometimes there's a link to each other. But how do we actually build the good explanation, right? And so there are many approaches, and as many of you will know, we're often like as people who need to create projects, we need to publish papers. There's a lot of pressure to do things relatively quickly, and it's hard to put more thought into how to answer our question properly. Right? So, and there's easy ways to get there. Well, easy as in like straightforward ways. Like hitting accuracy benchmarks in machine learning or in neuroscience. We're getting better, but then like, there might be blobs on the brain or some activity for some region that's higher for one condition than the other. Which doesn't really say that much about how it works, right? More recently, we're talking about like how models or like networks might correlate with brain activity, and there's stuff like brain score that says like how similar are these models in internal representation with the brain, or like how their behaviors are similar with the brain. So um, that's still quite cool, but doesn't really get us anywhere by themselves, right? So kind of stepping back a little bit with the approaches with like what is it that we're interested in, right? So there's various things that we want to explain, something like behaviors and brain activity, some neural pattern of activity. And so one approach that we kind of like want to push is like this multi-level approach. So the idea is that the behavior is the top level thing to explain, and then the brain systems might be various brain areas or brain neurons work together to implement cognitive functions that enable this behavior. And you can go lower, right? So neurons would be how cells, some of these work together to form systems, which then together work together to explain it, like enable the behavior. So I'm not saying that the behavior. Well, I think behavior is very important, and there might be a bit of a bias from my perspective. But I'm also saying that you can study anything in the middle or lower down. These are all very important questions. But the framing of like from the mechanistic point of view is like that you have some level at the top that can is well in a sense the thing that is on the top of the level that can be explained by the lower mechanism. Um, so one can make the argument that behavior is the most important in the sense that's evolutionary, like that's what the brain is for, what the behavior is for. But even if you don't make that argument, it's more about the abstraction layer of the mechanism, right? So you decompose what is the behavior is what the things that are working together to make the behavior possible. So the question is how to do this. So I think this is a little list that I think is very important. So we want task-driven models for explaining behavior. In my case, we're thinking about what are concepts. So we're thinking about how we categorize or group ideas, identify things. In space, you would be like how to self-localize or navigate in space. In terms of theory-based analysis, you want to know like what a model or what the brain is doing, what kind of units, groups of units represent, what kind of code they might have, what kind of knowledge organization they use, such as collection of information. And finally, we want to have some kind of intervention or a lesion test to see that these representations or mechanisms are actually useful for the behavior at hand, right? So you actually test by like intervening and then see if there's information content changes or the task performance changes. And why am I talking about it? I think the point is that of course now we have a lot of task performing models, but in the history of psychology and even AI, there's different kind of models that are not really like what we need, right? So there are models that aim to capture behavior but not brain activity, those that capture brain activity but not behavior. And so I guess there's some like even some excitatory inhibitory networks that are more about patterns of behavior in neurons rather than the cognitive behavior. And there's handcrafted and simplified features, right? So the argument might be that this is not real world behavior, we're missing something, and now we have much more powerful models that can do things that are more like humans, like actually compute images, do navigation in real actual images. There's comparable levels to human behavior, and you can actually compare the model with the brain activity, not only like just an abstract level, but there's units, there's well, sorry, an image, like specific images and words, and then there's units actively, and that can be compared to the brain. So we want to analyze how the brain do it. So before I say how people might do it, is that what is mechanism? What is a mechanistic explanation? So just very briefly, I wanted to explain this because this also relates to my second part of the talk with some of my work. Is that Carl Paver, the philosopher of science, talks about multi-level mechanisms. So the abstract idea here is that there's something like the behavior that needs to be explained. And then you have a few components that work together that give rise to behavior. And so that's a particular mechanism, but that mechanism have parts that also could be decomposed into another mechanism. So to be more concrete, you might have something like the circulatory system, and then you have different parts like the kidneys or the heart, and they work together to make the circulatory system work. But then you can decompose the parts like the kidneys, filtering units, and then that's the mechanism on itself. So Queer also gives the neuroscience example. You have the rat navigating the maze, and you have a spatial memory or a map in the hippocampus, kind of like at the time already talking about place cells. And then you can also decompose parts of those into like particular lower level, in this case, LTP methods. So you can see that this is a rather there's a rather vague kind of example here, at least for us. There's probably more levels between that we can talk about. But the idea is that the mechanistic levels work as an explanation, and at higher levels probably give rise to the interaction of components in lower levels. It's good to note that it's not a reductionist thing, that the higher level properties aren't explained by lower levels. It's not just multi-scale. This is about building explanations across levels, right? So there's, depending on what your behavior is or what's the theory about how, like, how this map's created, for example, then you have to build the levels as you see fit. And so relevance is also important. So some components are not relevant. So yeah, so get at the mechanism, we want to do these theory-based analysis, like what are the components doing, right? So what are the signal neurons doing? Are they driving the behavior? So you want to analyze probably the units in contribution to task. Is population more important? Maybe you have distributed code, and you need like different kind of methods like decoding like information readouts with task relevant variables in the population. So just briefly, I think it's probably clear to most people here, but we want to test the relevance of model parameters to the model. And in machine learning, I've heard people talk about computational methods as something like very general. But I think like in neuroscience or neuro AI, we're talking about something like a brain lesion. So we damage the neurons or the synapses and or the connection with units. And then we see what's happening to the model, right? Because that's like, what are the components that are relevant to the theory that affect the behavior that's of interest. Yeah. Of course, that could be anything in the model, but for here, this is my. So one like disclaimer kind of point, like don't we kind of do this already? And yeah, we do, but I think to an extent, right? So I think there is still a focus on performance in various ways, correlations between model and brains. And I guess worse in neuro, sometimes you just have blobs or no task or lack of theory, right? So I think it's just something that I've been thinking a lot about, and how we should be building our theories and testing them. And I think these three ingredients that I've been talking about it's something that is worth thinking about when we're designing and kind of tackling our problem. Consider each part quite deep. So that's kind of the motivation. Go into a few of the research projects. So I'll first talk about this project called the non-spatial account of place cells and bit cells based on clustering model and concept learning. So this is a simpler model. It's not an imaging a computable model, but I think it's the start of how we use task and analysis to like understand computation and the brain. So I'll go into a brief background on concept learning, categorizing, and causing models on the brain. So I'm not sure what the background of the audience, but I think it'd be worth talking a bit about cognitive science and some basic theories. Maybe it's interesting to you, but also it's relevant to the modeled algorithms. So super basic concepts are mental representations that allow the storage and use of knowledge about the world. They allow us to identify, classify objects. So I show you this, everyone sees that it's a dog. Many of you have seen this image, I'm sure. We're also very good at like classifying, between these things. So in this case, the blueberry muffin, the chihuahuas, and they're rather visually similar, but we're still pretty good at comparing to identify them. We can identify things that we haven't seen before either, right? So although this is pretty far away, and you probably have an idea that this might be a dog and probably a sheepdog as well, even though you might not have seen this particular Italian sheepdog called the Bergamasca. And so how do we do this? In cognitive science, we have lots of theories of learning and categorization. Most basically, the prototype theory. Here's a toy illustration. So you have birds at the top here, and mammals at the bottom here. And so the idea of the prototype theory is that the way we represent and categorize things is we have a category prototype in our minds, which is at center or the main mode of the distributions of the category. So in this case, you can see that this robin is very close to the center, and this rooster or this chicken is quite far out. So it's still within the distribution, of course, but it's a bit less typical. And same with this cat and the flying squirrel. So exemplar model is kind of on the other extreme. So you, instead of storing only one, central tendency of the category, you are encoding every single exemplar. So it's a kind of like a very memory heavy theory. It's saying that you encode every single item that you've seen before, every single bird, every single robin, and then you compute the similarity of your memories to what you see outside and say how similar is that. And some similarity, the highest some similarity with which category will be what what it belongs to. And so as you can probably infer, it's a much more powerful model. So here are some examples. If you have anything like like an XOR or like some exception like items, the prototype theory doesn't do as well, or can't do it at all because it only has one center, right? The exemplar model can do it, but it also does it at a cost of like remember every single thing. So I like giving this introduction because the clustering model that we use is a type of something in between the two. So as you see here, if you the clustering model can learn on a trial by trial basis, but it also can recruit clusters. So in the simple case, it basically learns 2 clusters and it becomes a prototype-like model. But it can also recruit clusters like this, right? So it recruits a cluster for each of the 2 distributions per category, and so you'll do the task without having to remember every single thing. And here is recruiting a cluster for the exceptions. And so this is a task-driven algorithmic model. And so it can done trial by trial, and we can kind of fit human behavior and also correlate this with brain activity. So giving you it's kind of this model, this clustering model is called Sustain, is originally produced by Brad Love, 2004. And this it's kind of captured various types of behavior, but this is the particular classic cognitive science one by Shepard. Very simple, 3 features, shape, color, and size. And so category A are on this side, category B on this side. And so this type 1 is the easiest one. You just have to know, oh, it's the black one during category A and the white category. Type 6 is the hardest one. You have to attend to all the features and kind of memorize basically these are the ones that are in category A and these are in category B. And type 2 to 5 are kind of somewhat in between. And what you can see here is these are human behavioral curves and the probability of error. So basically, if you learn it, your error is low. And for type 1, it's learned very quickly. And for type 6, it's learned a lot slower. what this shows is the output of the model, and the model is able to capture these behavioral curves very well. How about in the brain? So the nice thing about this model is that it learns trial by trial, and it produces, a parameter for various things every trial. And so if you do this in the MRI, you can do this whilst before learning. And so this is one of these category structures. There's the beetles in hole 1 and hole 2. And what you get are these parameter estimates for, in this case, recognition strengths, so the cluster activation strengths versus error correction. And what they found is that the hippocampus tracks these quantities during learning. And here you see that it's just a similar sort of different paradigm, and you kind of find a similar anterior hippocampal activation. And it's not just this group, but also other groups have found similar things related to learning in the hippocampus. So one question, if hippocampal involvement is about concept learning, or is there actually more general learning? So here I've talked a bit about the hippocampal formation and what it's been involved in, and as many of you know, it seems to be involved in a lot of things, and one question is why. So in the human brain, this pink area is the hippocampus, and patient HM is the famous one, where when he got his bilateral medial temporal lobe removed, including the hippocampus, he was able to form new memory, and then he had amnesia. There are also single cells in the hippocampus that people have called concept cells, and they seem to encode particular individuals. So here in this case, there's one neuron that fires only for the actress Jennifer Aniston and nothing else. And then, as I mentioned before, it seems like the hippocampus is also involved in concept learning and the formation. All over the other side of the field, we see the rodent brain has these interesting cells whilst they're doing spatial foraging or spatial navigation tasks. And these are place cells at the top here and grid cells at the bottom. And these place cells fire at a particular location in an environment, where place cells have this interesting pattern that tiles the surface. And people have talked about this as being useful for encoding space, a spatial map for navigation. But this is a lot of different things, right? So what's going on here? And so people have talked about maybe the hippocampal formation is not just for navigation, but there's a cognitive map and it's a space for abstract knowledge. And so people might be using this for navigation, but also it might be in conceptual spaces, like here in this case, there's different cars with different engine capacity and then weights. And the idea is that maybe in conceptual spaces, you can also do similar kinds of navigation. So you have representations of places in these spaces, place-like cells or grid-like cells. So one question, though, is what are the dimensions, right? So, in semantic space, it's quite high dimensional. There's a lot of empty or irrelevant space, like you can have an elephant that can fly. And is it always a simple Euclidean metric space? Is that a reasonable assumption? How about mazes? Like probabilistic knowledge? Is there really an easy mapping from one to the other? Some questions to keep in mind while we talk about this. But yeah, the idea here is that maybe there are some shared mechanisms for spatial cells representing concept of space. And the most basic idea could be something like place cells encode what you are in physical space. And concept cells encode what you're perceiving or thinking in high dimensional feature space. But how do we do this? So there are some theories and models. There are many, many more now before I made this slide, but the idea with some of the spatial folks is that space is more primary. It's maybe an evolutionary system for navigation, and it is a newer cognitive map-like style things for abstract concepts is built on this older system. Other ideas are saying that it actually represents states and structure. It's a very flexible framework, and you can do a lot of reinforcement learning and sequence learning with these systems. not unrelated, we propose that the information is a general learning system that can learn and construct knowledge across domains. So this is what our paper in 2019 claimed, that we had a model that could think across these two domains. So the idea is that if the model is such a domain general model, it should be able to learn both concept structures and on a navigation task do spatial representations. So here's a toy illustration of what the model can do. This is in a simple case, of course, you can do it in a much more high dimensional space as well. Again, with the birds at the top here and the mammals at the bottom here. On each trial, you have a cluster. You can recruit the cluster on the first trial and then say, oh, this is the closest cluster. Sorry, this image is most similar to this cluster's representation, so it moves slightly towards it. On the second trial, the cat comes out to the model, and then the closest cluster moves towards it. Over time, basically, you can learn the center of these distributions or multiple distributions, and is able to categorize accurately. How about in the spatial case? So you can have now, in this case, a circular environment, and let's just assume a bunch of clusters exist there, and you use the same learning rule, right? So you can have now an agent moving around here, and then the closest cluster moves towards the agent. Over time, clusters spread out, and you can see that sometimes they all become this grid-like lattice pattern. And so there's a few things to note here. So this is, there's an assumed number of clusters, and you can have fewer or more. But the difference between the spatial and the concept space here is that in the concept domain, you have in reality a much higher dimensional space, and it's not necessarily uniformly distributed. On the spatial case here, it's two-dimensional, and it's possible to traverse the whole space, right? And one of the ideas we propose in this paper is that this learning rule is able to reproduce concept-like representations and also spatial-like representations. But this is not because it's a spatial learning rule, right? It's actually a general learning rule that creates this kind of representation because of the nature of what space looks like. And this is not likely that this is useful, or at least directly useful, for concepts, because in conceptual space you have much more clumpy structure. The birds are all together. Mammals are very different in many ways to the birds. Some of them might be exceptions, but the idea is that the space is not uniform. It's much more high-dimensional. It might not make sense to have a Euclidean space. Rather, people talk about semantic space as warped, very, very sparsely coded, not sparse, sorry, very empty. There's a lot of empty space because it's not relevant, right? So there's very different from in the spatial case. So a general learning mechanism can lead to both concept and spatial representation found in the table formation. Grid cells are a special case where the environment is fully traversable spatial environment. So one thing that we didn't address is how neural assemblies learn. That is, the clusters are kind of these abstract things that might be encoded by a bunch of neurons. And we kind of like wave our hands a bit in this paper and say, oh yeah, we have a cluster here and maybe multiple cells that encode it. Right? So yeah, in the next part, we basically extended this work to make a neural population to try to kind of get at this question. So I mentioned where we have a multi-level discipline, and we need to consider various levels here. And so we map across levels through correlation. We might have behavior with the brain or model activity, but it's not really clear what the mapping is. So how do we link, for example, things like cluster or like some value to brain mechanism? How do we go beyond these correlations? And so I'm going to argue that we need to construct these theories and models that explain and capture the system, specifying the mechanistic links across levels. So in this project, I will talk about how we combine these multi-level explanations, and now we're in the process to link across models. Across levels from behavior to an abstract model to neurons. So as you might remember, actually I might have this here. Yeah. So as you might remember, I talked about mechanism and multi-level mechanism, how we can have a behavior that is explained by some mechanism. In this case, the cognitive model that I showed you earlier, and we want to decompose this model into lower level mechanisms to then explain both the model and the behavior. And so in Craver, they don't have this computational model aspect, and in something like Mars levels, there's no linking across levels because they're independent, right? So how do we decompose the cluster, right, to make like this lower level and this neural population that gives rise to the behavior? This is the slightly extended model, which is basically a multi-unit version of sustain. We don't decompose the cognitive model into a set of populations, and now we, instead of have a winner take all, we have K winner take all, and we learn it basically over time. It's not too important, but I think what the key point is that we have now millions of neurons, so how to coordinate neurons' activity. So we had inspiration from nature, and so I'm sure many of you know about the flocking algorithms. And so the idea is that using very simple local learning rules, you can say something like move towards direction that your neighbors do, and that kind of like generates this coordinated activity. And so now, instead of having one cluster that just moves towards the stimulus whilst they're learning, we have a multiple. So I just put 5 here, but actually it's a few hundred or a few thousand in our cases. And so on each trial, you might see a cat, and then these units learn by like making their tuning more like that particular cat. But they also have this recurrent step, which is that only the top end neurons will move toward each other. And that kind of makes it tighter. It learns a bit more stable in a stable way, and can produce a bit more like two very strongly tuned neurons. Just to make this extra clear, if you have like apples and oranges here, you might have move towards the apple. On this next trial, you move them towards each other. Same with the oranges. So your orange, the units are recruited, and then they move towards the orange, and then they move towards each other. And at the end, you just have some very, very tuned cells. This is just to show the Shepherd's 6 types, and we have the behavior, and this much scaled up model can still capture this behavior. I want to show you how it kind of does it. This is type 1, and as you remember, there's 3 features, and it only needs to care about the color feature, right? So that's separated on this dimension. This is the XOR. So since it's 3 dimensions, one of the dimensions doesn't matter, but it creates like these 4 virtual clusters, if you like. And finally, with type 6, it basically does a memorization thing where each of the corners are kind of like creates a little cluster. And in the spatial case, I mentioned that we had to define the number of clusters before, and now we actually just start with a few thousand units, have the same learning rule, and then as the agent moves around, the units self-organize and create this kind of like pattern again. So this is the animation kind of unfolded over time. And here are some examples of the end states and the grid-like pattern. So in conclusion, this shows how the neural assemblies can form by local rules, where the neural flocking rule kind of produces similarly tuned assemblies with concept and place cell-like representations. So previously, we assumed a set of number of clusters or place cells, but here cell assemblies form representing concepts or locations. And the scale. So we can have millions of neurons now and show the same behavior. So it is important for kind of favored multi-level mechanism point, right? So you have a lower level neural population that can capture some like cognitive behavior that you're interested in. but it goes right to the capturing. Sorry, it captures the intermediate behavior, and then it also captures the higher level cognitive behavior. So the summary of the last two studies is that general learning mechanism seems to capture spatial and concept representations with campus formation. Inspired by flocking, we suggest that campus could do this by recurrence. They coordinate neurons, and this leads to virtual clusters, concept cells, and place cell assemblies. And so the multi-level count links across these levels for explanation of behavior to neurons, extending more to multi-level explanation. So I'm just looking at time right now. So I think I will be able to talk a little bit more. Yeah, I'll talk about this project, which is relatively short, and see how we go with time. And if there's questions, maybe I'll stop. So I've been talking about these place cells and grid cells, and of course they exist. We can talk about how their properties and how they might be useful for navigation or concept representation. But I mean, those are not the only cells that exist, right? So people have to define what the cells are. They have criteria for what they are. But I mean, these are very interpretable neurons, right? You think that, oh, this is the location for space. This is how I encode this particular space. And other people talked about, obviously, things like head direction cells and grid cells. They sound like, okay, this is encoding head direction, so I know where I'm going. Grid cells might tell you how to go where you want to go, or in combination with these cells. But are these spatial cells really cell types with like very specific and well-defined for space? I mean, one of the alternatives is that they are useful for the computation, but they might not be the only one that are useful. So whether or not these the way that we define these cells is the only way to go. So how can we test this? And so with postdoc Xiaoyang Luo, we use a virtual reality with a deep neural network approach. So it's very simple. In this case, now we're just using image computer neuron model. They're trained on object recognition or untrained, and so the point is not actually navigation here. The agent is in this kind of lab environment and it kind of moves around a bit. And but there are various spatial variables, like where am I in this square environment? How far am I from the border? Which way am I heading? And so this is just the environment, and these are the things that the model sees. And so really this is a null model. So there's no spatial knowledge, no learning, no plasticity. And we want to see, were there actually any spatial cells or any spatial information in them? And so it kind of opens the question, if it looks spatial, does it mean that it's actually for that function? Or are they actually useful for that function? So we test this a bit with a task as well. And so what we find, surprisingly, is that there are quite a lot of these cells available in these deep neural networks already. Just so this is the square environment, and this is like one unit that encodes, this particular location, this one in this corner. These didn't have very strong directional tuning. These cells, on the other hand, had more directional tuning, and these are border-like cells. So one question is, were these cells especially useful, or rather, does the population have the information about it? So we use a linear decoder to try to test whether these models had spatial information, right? So in this case, XY location, head direction, or distance to border, and we use leave like 30% out, training on each of the layers of the deep neural networks to see how much information was there. And overall, it did really well. So can see that for both trained and untrained models, they did very significant, better than chance decoding. This is chance up here for to measure the chance. This is direction decoding, and this is nearest border decoding. And there's a lot more details in the paper, but just to very briefly say that we excluded spatial units. So as we decrease the number of of highly spatially informative units, i.e. place border cells and heteroaction cells, it didn't really affect the decoding. So it seems that the other units were more important. We could also remove useful units for the spatial, like, the actual task, and then that seemed to hurt it more. So of course, there was useful units here and there, but didn't seem like the spatial units in this model particularly useful. Or rather, there was no extra information. So in sum, we found these spatial cell types in non-spatial networks. Individual cells play a minor role for representing spatial information, even the strong spatial ones, and the population seem to match more. So in conclusion, finding spatial cell types doesn't mean that it's necessarily fundamental to spatial cognition. Our intuitive interpretation of the cell's function representing space may not map onto the cell's actual function. And so one question is, are spatial cell types real, or the type a real thing? That's not really, like, we can't say for sure here, but then at the least we think that there should be a higher bar for strong thing of function, saying that, this is the cell for this thing. May not be, as useful. And this is, still a very common thing in neuroscience, and this is a particular type of cell, which seems to suggest that, all of the cells might not be really as important. And of course, not everyone thinks in that way, but this is not necessarily the right way to think about neural coding. So, I've noticed that I've talked for about 45 minutes. I could mention another project quite briefly, but I'm not sure if the system is more like 45 minutes plus questions, or should I talk a little bit more about this project as well, if you're interested.
How about we see if there's any questions right now, and if there aren't,
Yeah.
we can do the last part with you.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I was curious if the clustering account of grid cells accounted for multi-scale grid cells and the kind of ratios that are observed between these different scales in neuroscience.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the model can capture that, but not naturally, right? So there's a parameter that can, set the number of, in the first one, the number of units, the second one, the scale of the units, but it would be a more free parameter that would set it, so it doesn't naturally come out. I think this is a more general point, which I think is still something that's quite important, is that there's less evidence, from what I know, of the perfectly scaled grid cells in other animals. For example, there seems to be a bit like coding in humans, but it's a bit less clear how those ratios come out. And actually looking at intracranial reporting, I think it's also very it's a much more difficult to see, like, I guess, rodents like grid cells. So then, if it's not as perfectly represented in that way, then it's hard to see the modules occurring. Not to say that they don't exist, but then it's a bit still an open question.
Thank you. I just have one other question. In the previous work, you found that removing these spatial cell types and not disrupt the decoding of various useful spatial information. So then what do you think is the functional use of those types? Why do they exist? What sort of behavioral purposes?
Yeah, so I don't think that they're not useful for the thing. I just don't think that there's a privileged role in there, right? So I think this is I guess the strong version of the argument is that if you remove the cells or the units in the model and they barely do affect your task behavior, then I mean in cognitive neuroscience you would actually just say, oh, that's not useful. I think that might be a bit too strong, but that's just saying that they're not privileged compared to the non-defined as spatial cells. So I think one of the things that points we're making in this paper is that And I think the thing is that all spatial neurophysiologists kind of know this as well, is that there are a lot of decisions you have to make, like when you do these experiments. And I think we are kind of I wouldn't say stuck, but like people use these measures because it's a useful way to kind of analyze their data. But because now you can record so many cells, there's less reason to say, okay, I need to find a cell that actually reacts to this task, and then okay, that we have to characterize that cell. There's lots of cells that are contributing to the task, and like whether or not these like spatial cell types are like natural kinds is a different question. I think people say the literature seems to say that, oh, these are particular types of cells, which suggests that other cells are not really important for spatial navigation. Maybe that's not what everyone thinks, but I think the defining of these cells can be problematic if we take it a bit too far. And we don't really need to do that anymore, especially with the large scale imaging or neural pixels like recording.
Thank you.
Yeah, also. So I actually agree with the weak interpretation that we should look at the diversity of cell types and not just kind of look at these ones that we can interpret nicely. However, I also very strongly disagree with your strong conclusion that these cell types actually don't exist, or that it doesn't make sense to cluster them this way. And I have the feeling that you never actually looked at actual neural data. Have you? Because if you have, then you might have just, for instance, looked at post-tuberculum and removed the head direction cells there, and then you see that you can no longer decode the head direction, right? So it, like, I do feel, no, I'm very sure that the arrangement of the cells and the fact that they're modularly present in the brain, for instance, in post-tuberculum, you have head direction cells, in hippocampus, you have grid cells, and border cells, and so on. And the fact that they are separated between these brain regions is meaningful. It's not just like in your CNN where you train with backprop and then some meaningful cell types pop up randomly. And of course, if you remove them, you can still decode everything, right? Because all the information is distributed, but this is exactly not the case in the brain. And this is the meaningful thing here. We have a very strong inductive bias in the brain towards these spatial cell types. And it's meaningful, and yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that question. No, this is good so that I can, make my point as well. So the first point is that I think there's two parts of this round, right? One is whether or not the definitions are the right way to go, right? We still have to make some criteria saying, is this how spatially selective this is and how spatially not selective this is, and make a threshold. And it's not like you have a bimodal distribution of what a place cell is or a grid cell. Like grid cells are even worse. So I mean, in terms of seeing data, I admit that I'm not a neurophysiologist, so I haven't looked like with an electrode, but I have seen very much place and grid cell data and some heterogeneous cell as well. But so the point here is that the distribution of place scores with scores all types are not like it's not a bimodal distribution, right? Or even trimodal, whatever you like. It's much more continuous than people who are not familiar with literature, I think. So the second point is how these cells are modular and they're more like distributed more in particular brain locations, right? So I think that there's a few points about that. Is that I do accept that's probably true, that there are more proportion of cells in various areas, and especially in species like the rodents. But I think this is also something that seems to be continuously I'm not sure if overturned is the right word, but continuously discussed, right? It's like this brain region has like for example, medial internal cortex has 20% grid cells. I mean, that's a good amount, but that's still not the whole thing. What happens when you find these kind of cells in different brain areas? So not all the best examples, but there are place-like tunings in in mouse V1. Some people argue they've found grid cells in somatosensory cortex. These are also distributed everywhere. So there's 2 points. There's a few points here to consider here. Are those also doing the same things across all brain regions? Are they spatial cells, or are they actually motor cells, which also show these representations? I think the problem with the definitions of cell types kind of becomes more apparent when you think about these things. So there are whether or not like head direction cells are super important in the rodent brain in that area, that may well be true. But then I think there's a bigger picture question as well about defining these functional cell types in this way. And I guess this relates back to my point about constraining with theory or the behavior that we're interested as well. But yes, so basically, I hope I've convinced you, or at least agree with me, that it's important to build explanations on how brains and models work rather than just using benchmarks of correlations. I talked about a few projects, and really the point I think is that we would like moving forward, everyone, but like I'm talking to myself as well, to think more deeply about our question and approaches using methods like these to build better explanations for understanding brain and model. So very briefly, I just wanted to tell you about in my lab, I'm going to be working on from how we learn concepts, like early category learning to solidity concepts, trying to model various regions. Going to be training neural networks to look a bit more at humans using like different learning rules or architectures. And we have lots of methods in the institute, functional MRI, e.g. Transcranial ultrasound simulation, looking at deeper brain structures. So we have 3 MRI scanners, MEG, which is all free to use. And this is just some collaborative work as well that we're going to pursue. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening. I will also be hiring and raise fellowship opportunities for postdocs at the unit. Do reach out if you have any interest in doing this kind of stuff. Thank you very much, and happy to get any more questions.